Now, this latest tariff threat is also a serious concern in Alberta. Well, energy is our largest export to the United States. Alberta beef and dairy producers are also potentially at risk.
I've always said this as a dairy farmer. To me, it's the biggest joke. We're supply managed. That means we manage the supply that people demand.
Canada, what they've done to our dairy farm workers is a disgrace.
What happens when a country stops caring about price and starts demanding proof? That's exactly what Mexico just did. U.S. milk shipments, cheaper and in bulk, were abruptly rejected and even destroyed at the border. Meanwhile, Canada walked in with a deal worth billions. This isn't a trade war, it's a shift in global priorities. Transparency, safety, and ethics are now deciding who wins the food game. And this may be just the beginning. Recently, an abrupt and dramatic disruption shook North American dairy trade. At a key crossing on the Texas-Mexico border, Mexican authorities refused an entire U.S. milk shipment, estimated at over 250,000 gallons, with reports of refrigeration tanks turned away or destroyed. At the same time, Mexico quietly finalized a $3.2 billion 7-year dairy contract with Canada, marking a significant shift in supply strategy, not based on price, but on origin transparency and strict production standards. Mexico had long been the largest market for U.S. dairy exports, accounting for nearly one-third of U.S. dairy exports by 2024 and $2.5 billion in annual volume. Despite American milk being roughly 15% cheaper per gallon than Canadian, it was immediately rejected in favor of Canadian milk that offered traceability, hormone-free practices, and individual carton-level transparency. What once seemed an unbreakable trade partnership abruptly ended, not with tariffs or trade wars, but with a message: we need to know where our milk comes from. By early 2025, Mexico rolled out a new set of dairy import requirements that instantly rewrote the rules for suppliers. These weren't about trade tariffs or pricing, they were about production ethics and transparency. First, all imported milk must now come from cows that have never been treated with growth hormones like RBST. Second, feed must be completely plant-based, no animal byproducts allowed. And third, each milk carton must be fully traceable, all the way back to the individual farm, with QR codes showing animal treatment history, feed logs, and even on-site vet certifications. For many U.S. producers, that level of documentation simply doesn't exist. Much of their tracing is done in batches, not at the carton level. Hormone use is also common in American dairy production, unlike in Canada, where such practices have long been banned. Because Canada already met these standards through its national supply management system, it became the natural replacement. That's why Mexico chose Canadian milk, even though it's more expensive. This wasn't just about food anymore. It was about trust. While U.S. dairy has long been praised for volume and cost efficiency, its production methods clash sharply with Mexico's new standards. Most large-scale U.S. farms rely on batch-level traceability, meaning milk is tracked by lot or processing group, not individual cow to carton. This makes detailed origin tracking impossible under Mexico's rules. Meanwhile, growth hormones like RBST, still used in many U.S. operations, are banned outright under Mexico's regulations, requiring a level of transparency and ethics that the U.S. model doesn't guarantee today. Despite voluntary traceability programs, such as the U.S. Dairy Stewardship Commitment, adoption remains uneven and often lacks the deep data infrastructure required, like standardized QR-linked farm records needed for full compliance. Even though some processors reject hormonally produced milk, comprehensive national compliance is lacking. In short, the scale-first approach of U.S. dairy, focused on maximizing gallons, left producers without the systems required for the trust-focused trade shift. Without the ability to provide transparent cow-to-carton traceability and strict hormone bans, American milk simply couldn't compete in Mexico's new regulatory landscape. Canada didn't just meet Mexico's new dairy standards, it had already been operating by them for years. The country's strict supply management system, in place since the 1970s, regulates everything from production limits to pricing and quality assurance. But more importantly, it bans growth hormones and animal byproduct feeds entirely, while enforcing traceability at the carton level. Every liter of Canadian milk is linked to a specific farm, with animal welfare protocols and feed history logged and verified. When Mexico demanded hormone-free, fully traceable milk, Canada was ready. there was no need to scramble or reform existing systems. And in mid-2025, Ottawa doubled down with Bill C-202, locking in protections for its supply-managed dairy under future trade agreements. That law made it nearly impossible for foreign lobbying, especially from the U.S., to weaken Canada's dairy standards in cross-border negotiations. In this case, Canada's cautious, highly regulated approach paid off. While the U.S. focused on scale, Canada quietly built a system centered on transparency. That trust is now turning into real trade power. What really grabs attention isn't how much money Mexico spent, but why? On paper, American milk was up to 15% cheaper per gallon than Canadian. For budget-conscious buyers, saving a few cents per gallon translates into millions in cost efficiencies. Yet Mexico still made the switch, less volume for more assurance. To put it another way, under the old system, $1,000 could buy roughly 378 gallons of U.S. milk, sufficient for dozens of households. With Canadian supply, that same budget buys only around 310 gallons, about 20% less volume than before. On volume alone, American milk should have reigned supreme, but it didn't. That's because Mexico stopped buying gallons. They started buying confidence. They accepted paying more because Canadian milk came with guaranteed traceability, hormone-free feed systems, and safety standards. They weren't gambling on cheapest supply. They opted for supply they knew they could defend in the court of public opinion. In a rapidly changing food culture, transparency became more valuable than price. This wasn't simply a financial decision, it was a cultural and regulatory one. Looking ahead, the OECD and FAO's Agricultural Outlook 2025 to 2034 highlights a powerful trend. Countries that invest in transparent supply chains and traceability will capture a larger share of agricultural exports, not by producing more, but by earning credibility. According to their projections, economies that meet ethical and environmental standards are expected to see a 28% to 35% increase in export competitiveness over the next decade. This shift isn't theoretical, it aligns directly with Mexico's move toward Canadian dairy. Trust, not price, is becoming the new currency of food trade. The OECD report emphasizes that rising diets in middle-income nations will fuel demand for animal-source foods, but increasingly from sources that prove their safety, origins, and standards. In this emerging landscape, transparency-enabled agriculture isn't just better, it's better positioned. For the U.S., this means that scaling up output may no longer secure global market share unless coupled with ethical traceability systems. Canada already benefits from this shift. As markets grow more sophisticated, the ability to prove what you sell becomes as important as how much you sell. The rejection of U.S. milk exports created a ripple effect on the ground, especially among small and mid-sized dairy farms. As export demand from Mexico evaporated almost overnight, many farms found themselves orphaned. Without long-term contracts, they were left with unsellable milk that still needed refrigeration, feed, and labor. Over 6,000 small U.S. dairy farms have shut down in the last 3 years, about 10% of the sector, while remaining farms are losing roughly $27,000 to $110,000 annually depending on herd size, just to stay afloat. For a typical 250-cow operation, that loss translates to between 11% and 46% of net farm operating income. Many farmers report earning only 80 to 90 cents per gallon, below production costs which now average around $1.10 to $1.20 per gallon. In one case study, a family dairy supplying Mexico saw weekly surpluses of up to 8,000 gallons, representing $2,000 to $3,000 lost per month. Staff numbers halved, equipment fell idle. Farmers described the emotional weight, not just losing income, but a legacy. Meanwhile, corporate agribusinesses with diversified revenue streams and legal teams remain largely shielded. But for America's small dairy backbone, this shift has felt like abandonment. The collapse of U.S. dairy access to Mexico isn't an isolated trade blip. It signals a broader strategic shift. For decades, the U.S. reigned as the dominant dairy supplier across North America. In 2023, Mexico took in over 20% of U.S. dairy exports, making it the country's largest overseas market. That dominance, built on volume and low cost, was the foundation of U.S. leadership in global dairy trade. Now, with Montreal riding high on transparency and compliance, the geopolitical balance is shifting. Organizations like the U.S. Dairy Export Council warn that without reform, the U.S. could lose up to 20% of its global market share over the next decade, meaning annual export losses of $1.5 billion to $1.6 billion. That's not just revenue gone, it's geopolitical influence waning in agricultural partnerships and trust-based trade forums. Other markets, particularly in Europe and Asia, are already enforcing similar standards around hormone bans, ethical sourcing, and supply chain traceability. Without adaptation, U.S. dairy risks becoming a commodity supplier in a world increasingly demanding narratives and credentials. Once celebrated as the global food hub, America may now find its agricultural voice slipping toward the sidelines, not because of quality or quantity, but perceived credibility. What's happening in dairy is echoing across food markets worldwide. Nations like Germany, Japan, and across the EU are tightening food import rules, demanding greater transparency, banning hormone and antibiotic use, and auditing environmental impacts. Even American meat exports face scrutiny. Countries have increasingly rejected U.S. beef due to concerns over hormones such as clenbuterol. Similarly, non-GMO grain preferences in Japan and Germany reflect deeper consumer demand for clarity and safety. These shifts underscore a broader reality. Countries aren't just trading goods, they're trading assurance. Consumers now want to know who raised the animal, what it ate, whether it was treated humanely, and whether their purchase aligns with core values like sustainability and health. That means labels like Made in USA no longer guarantee trust by default. Mexico's decision isn't a one-off. It's a symptom of what economists call the trust economy, where regulatory compliance and ethical production become the primary competitive edge. Whether it's dairy, meat, produce, or packaged goods, export success increasingly depends on supply chains that can prove their integrity. Countries unwilling to adapt risk being sidelined, not by price, but by credibility. So tell me, will U.S. agriculture evolve fast enough to match the world's new expectations? Subscribe for more real-world insights and stay informed on the future of food, trade, and global credibility.